Thanks everyone for coming. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Lauren Weber, author of In Cheap We Trust, the story of a misunderstood American virtue. It seems like this book couldn't have come at a better time, as the recession has caused Americans to reconsider their tendency to consume rather than save, to enlarge their debts instead of tightening the belt. But Lauren begins her book talking about a different kind of American, her father, who kept their Connecticut home at 50 degrees during winters, used hand signals instead of turn signals on their car, and taught his children how to ration toilet paper, although this last idea didn't really work out. Lauren writes that she resented this at first, but came to understand the virtues her father had passed down to her. Last month, she told the New York Times, "I like the word cheap. I embrace it. To me, it really means self-determination and freedom." Lauren was a staff reporter at Reuters and Newsday, and has written for the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. She currently lives in New York City. And I gotta say, she really practices what she preaches. Despite not being a local, Lauren used BART and Caltrain to get here from the East Bay, so no fancy car for her. After Lauren talks and reads from the book a little bit, please feel free to come up to the mic. There's one mic, I believe, and ask her questions. So please give a warm welcome to Lauren Weber.
Thank you, and thanks, Katie, for introducing me and for inviting me. I was telling her when my publicist sent along the email inviting me to come to Google, I was like, oh my God, I feel like I've made it. And some of you probably do too, for being able to work here and eat that food every day. When I told friends I was coming, they all said, "Can you eat in the cafeteria?" And I will report back that I did. So thanks again for having me. I sense from the composition of the audience that cheapness is a topic that resonates more for men than for women, maybe. And I was also telling Katie that I've done, after some of the media stuff that I've done, including the New York Times, the interview with the Frugal Traveler blog of the New York Times, I have gotten a few very random emails from men proposing to me. And usually they say, there have been 3 marriage proposals, I think. And usually they say, women keep breaking up with me because they call me too cheap. So they seem to hope that I could, embrace that part of them. So... And I'm always happy to tell them that, I actually do have a boyfriend and he's even cheaper than me. He can't pass a dumpster without climbing into it. So, yeah, I met him when I interviewed him for the book. So, we're pretty well matched. Katie mentioned my dad, and this is actually the first audience I've spoken to that didn't include at least one person who knew my father. My dad did, in fact, keep the heat at 50 degrees when I was growing up in Connecticut. He's an economist. He taught economics for 40 years at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. And so he's an economist in every sense of the word, professionally, and then in the fact that he economizes on everything. He did keep the heat at 50 degrees, and I would do my homework at the kitchen table wearing hats and scarves and with my hands on the stove after dinner to try to keep warm. He tried to ration our family's toilet paper, which fortunately he couldn't figure out a way to monitor it. So this was long before webcams. And so he fortunately gave up on that one. He does, in fact, use hand signals out the window of the car rather than using his turning signal, because I think he thinks this way he preserves the bulb in the light on the car. He also insisted on washing all of our dishes by hand, and he didn't use soap. And he used cold water and no soap. And eventually we figured this out and realized this was why the knives and forks were usually encrusted with food. And, my dad you could call him compulsively cheap. So I grew up my whole life trying to figure him out. And like Katie said, I also complained bitterly about it. My mother did too. In fact, while I was working on the book, I interviewed both my parents, and I asked my mom, how did you manage to coexist for so long with Dad? They're still married 44 years later. And she said, I should have divorced him a long time ago. And it turned out they had an argument about something else that morning, so that's partly why there was a lot of acrimony there. But she said, don't tell that story. Tell the story of how I once packed all 3 of you up, I have a brother and a sister, and threatened to take you all to a motel because the house was so cold. And apparently she did get us all to get our homework into our bags and pack some clothes for school the next day. And I think my dad at that point realized that the hotel would be more expensive, and so the heat went up. And I did complain about this much of my childhood. And then when I got older, and especially as I started to support myself, I realized that I had kind of involuntarily turned into my father. When I moved to Seattle, I moved in with my boyfriend there, and I wouldn't let him turn the heat above 60 degrees. So I was not quite as extreme, but I was still a bit of a fascist about the heat. And I also found myself, walking 30 blocks to save $2 on the subway when I moved to New York, and doing all kinds of weird things to save money. I realized I had kind of turned into my father. And I also strangely realized that I appreciated what he had taught me. He had given me some really important lessons on how to live within my means and on the value of doing that. And when I was able to sort of take a step back from it, I also was able to appreciate the fact that he's one of the most generous people I've ever known. He gives a lot of money to charity as well as time. He's always volunteering for a lot of different organizations he believes in. So he gives money to anybody who needs it. I think he has a real sense of his own good fortune in life. And he also sent 3 kids to very expensive private universities and never uttered a word of complaint. And what I came to realize over time was that my dad wasn't just cheap in a crazy way. He actually really had his priorities in order and knew what was important to him. And that he may have gone crazy if you were in the shower for longer than 3 minutes. There would always be a knock on the door. But he really knew what his values were, and I started to really respect that about him, and also feel grateful that he taught me how to live within my means. And so that's kind of the personal angle to the story. And then the other angle is that I'm a business reporter by training, and I worked for Reuters for a few years and then for Newsday, the paper for Long Island. And I was really interested in the macroeconomics of these issues of spending and saving. I wanted to understand what it meant that Americans had such a low savings rate, which in the last decade or so has been around 2%. In 2005, it actually dipped into negative territory for the first time since the Great Depression, which means Americans were spending more than we were earning. So I wanted to understand what that meant, what it meant that Americans had so much debt. We lived in what another historian has called the age of leverage, and what the implications of all that were. So I kind of brought both the personal side and my professional interests to writing the book. And so that's kind of like the background for why it resonated so much for me. And then the moment when the idea for the book actually came to me, I was sitting on the subway underneath Brooklyn. I live in Queens, so I was on the G train. Anybody here who's a New Yorker knows it goes between Brooklyn and Queens. And I was reading another book. It was called The Progress Paradox by Greg Easterbrook. It's not a well-known book, but I had seen it and was interested because it basically asks the question, why, if America is the most affluent nation that's ever existed, why are there such high levels of depression and anxiety and unhappiness here? And there wasn't anything in particular in the book that sparked this question, but I suddenly looked up and thought to myself, what happened to thrift in America? And it seemed to me that there was maybe some connection between the hyper-materialistic culture that we live in and these very high rates of unhappiness and depression. So that became kind of the animating question of the book, was what happened to thrift in America? It used to be an important American value, and it's a part of our national mythology of who we are and who we were, Ben Franklin and all that. Did this just go off? Is it still on? Can everybody still hear me? Okay. Yeah, something just happened to the sound. Oh, is it back on? Okay, I think it's back on. So yeah, this was once an important American value, and it seemed that it was no longer a part of our sense of who we are today. So the book has a lot of history in it, and about 2/3 of it is history, and it sort of follows this question of what happened to thrift in America, and I kind of came up with 2 different and almost contradictory answers. One part of that is, on some level, we actually were never a thrifty nation to begin with. It's a myth that we've sustained about ourselves for a long time. For much of our history, Americans were frugal because they had to be. It was a question of necessity much more than choice. There was the economy was terribly unregulated. It was all based on booms and busts for much of the 1700s and 1800s, And so people, had no choice but to live extremely cheaply. And this was a time also when any dress you wore was something that you had stayed up until 11 o'clock stitching by candlelight, or any cord of firewood that you burned was wood that you yourself had gone out and cut down. So people also had a really great appreciation for the value of the things in their lives. Now we live in a world where, we sit on chairs, we have no idea where they came from or who made them, or we, most of us eat food that we have no idea where it came from. Maybe not here at Google, but, so back in those days, people were deeply connected to the resources that they used, and they had no money. So as a result, they were probably what we would consider frugal today, very resourceful, it just went off again, I think. There it is. Very resourceful, very prudent and cautious about spending. But if you look at it in history, anytime Americans had more, that their incomes went up or had more access to credit, and that was often really the key to it, they spent. So I often say thrift was a virtue Americans couldn't wait to relinquish. Whether it was installment plans in the 1850s to buy a sewing machine or the first credit cards in the 1950s, as soon as Americans had greater access to cheap money, they took advantage of it. As much as we like to think of ourselves as having been frugal back then, often, again, it was economic necessity and sometimes political necessity. So like during the American Revolution, there were a lot of boycotts of British products. And this is where we get the Tea Party from, the Boston Tea Party. And there was what I would call conspicuous frugality going on back then. Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, all those guys were trying to get Americans to stop buying imported goods. And townspeople would get up together and sign petitions saying that they would never drink British tea. They called it poison. They would say that they would only wear homespun, which was coarse textiles made in America, rather than silks and linens from Britain and all that. As soon as the revolution ended, all of that well-meaning frugality sort of went out the window, and suddenly everybody wanted Rococo furniture from France and these British ideals of gentility where flirting was practiced as an art, and everybody wanted to have a parlor with a piano and a tea set, were very popular. So thrift has been a virtue Americans have sort of taken on when it's convenient and jettisoned when it was no longer necessary. So that was one of my answers was we were never a particularly thrifty nation, that it was not necessarily, it was often more of a virtue that Americans admired than aspired to. And then the other answer, which may seem a little bit contradictory, is that we were kind of frugal in the sense that thrift was something that we admired, but then around the middle of the 20th century, we really developed into a consumer society, and this was not just something that happened accidentally. It was practically an orchestrated effort after World War II. World War II, along with being a military effort, was also a gigantic stimulus program. And after the Depression, it was the war that put people back to work and created a lot of need for factories and for production and manufacturing and stuff like that. And even before the war ended, there were a lot of economists and politicians who were very concerned that once the war was over, there would be no engine for the economy. They were really worried that we would plunge back into a depression, which was a very reasonable concern. It was a traumatic event for many Americans. So in the early 40s, you start to sort of get this groundswell of public propaganda about how once the war's over, we got to start buying, now we're using all of our metal for shrapnel or for bullets and stuff. After the war is over, it's going to be dishwashers. And advertisers use that kind of language too. In fact, I think it's not a coincidence that Scrooge McDuck, who was Donald Duck's miserly uncle, appears in 1947, and I sort of date that as around the time that frugality went from being a virtue and something that we looked up to and championed to being sort of a punchline. It now became funny when people saved money. They were miserly rather than frugal. It was no longer a virtue, it was an insult, a punchline, something, an eccentricity or a quirk. So, there was and it was all over the culture. Brides magazine did a story in I think it was the late 40s, saying that newlyweds should outfit their homes with brand name goods, not only because it would make their houses look better, but because it would keep Americans at work. This idea that it was patriotic to spend and that it was your civic duty to be a consumer, became very widespread, and it's something that I think Americans have really deeply internalized. And when I was a reporter at Newsday, I covered retail for a few years, so I was always like ambushing shoppers in the middle of their Christmas shopping and like jumping out from behind racks of clothes to ask them like what they were buying and why. And I can't even count the number of times that people would sort of sheepishly laugh and tell me they were doing their part to help the American economy. It's just an idea that we've now taken in deeply. So, it was interesting to me to sort of track the history of that. I'm going to read a couple of, and one thing I also want to add is that when I started working on the book, a friend of mine said that I should call it Thrift, A Short History of a Dying Virtue. And the more that I talked to people, the more convinced I was that it wasn't dying at all. In fact, it was alive and well, and there are still thousands and probably millions of people living frugally by choice. And, because everybody I talked to would say, oh, you've got to interview my mother or my brother or my boss or my daughter or my husband often. And, it was clear that there are lots and lots of people living this way. So my feeling is that thrift is alive and well. It just kind of went underground at a certain point. And like I said, I sort of date that to that post-war period when we started getting the message that we needed to keep shopping, otherwise we weren't good Americans. And of course, September 11th was sort of the apogee of that idea when both Rudy Giuliani and George Bush and countless others got up and told Americans to go out and spend. It was the exact opposite message that Americans received in World War II, where the whole idea was to sacrifice. So I'm going to read a little bit from one of my historical chapters and then read a little bit from one of the later chapters. This chapter was one of my favorites to write. It's called Cheap Jews and Thrifty Chinese. It's all about the ethnic stereotypes of cheapness. And my family's Jewish, and I always felt that part of the way that people looked at my father as kind of an eccentric and a nut and, totally cheap had something to do with him being Jewish, that there was a particular way of combining those two qualities in him, the cheapness and the Jewishness. So this was a really fun chapter to research and then put together. And so I'll just read the first couple pages of it. In 1885, a theater group in New York debuted a new comic play by Frank Eugene Chase called A Ready-Made Suit. The play revolved around a woman who's charged with polygamy after marrying 9 men in quick succession. During her trial, 2 Jews described as eminent jobbers in second-hand clothes appear in court to testify. As one of them explains to the jury, they both married the defendant on the same day because, quote, "Vi dinks if we can get one wife between us, dat will be less expensive." The crowd no doubt roared in appreciation of the joke. They certainly would have understood the subtext. By this time, the image of the stingy, grasping Jewish merchant or pawnbroker was a familiar one in American popular culture, a staple of dime novels, variety shows, humor magazines, and newspaper editorials. It's one that remains with us today, hardly dulled by age or political correctness. For instance, there's the popular joke about how Moses received the 10 Commandments from God. One day, God appears to a Babylonian and says, "I have a commandment, I'd like to give it to you." The Babylonian says, "What is it?" And God says, "Thou shalt not steal." The Babylonian says, "No thanks." So God goes over to an Egyptian and offers him the same deal. When the Egyptian hears what the commandment is, he also turns it down. Then God meets Moses and says, "I have a commandment for you." Moses says, "How much is it going to cost me?" "Nothing," says God. "Fine," says Moses, "I'll take 10. It's funny. There are countless variations on the theme. Why did the Jews wander in the desert for 40 years? Because one of them dropped a nickel. What's a Jewish dilemma? Free pork. I think they're funny. Jews aren't the only ethnic group to have been branded with the scarlet letter C. Go back in history and you'll find a glut of accusations, often muffled in humor, sometimes loosed with open contempt, by one group that its neighbors or adversaries are cheap or miserly or obsessed with money and accumulation. The English viewed the Scots as hopeless cheapskates, while the Irish were written off as drunks and spendthrifts. The Dutch have a long reputation for being tight with cash. Ben Franklin himself popularized the rhyme, "The thrifty maxim of the wary Dutch is to save all the money they can touch." In America, Yankees, members of old families of New England, were both admired and reviled for their legendary thrift. Scandinavians, Germans, and Japanese were tagged as parsimonious by American writers, and Westerners used up a great deal of ink describing the frugal ways of Chinese living in China and abroad. Why have so many ethnic and national groups been cast in the role of the world's tightwads? The late Harvard psychologist Gordon Allport once said that stereotypes are projection screens for modern man's anxieties, and this one is no different. The stereotypes of cheap Jews and thrifty Chinese, two of the most enduring examples and the ones I explore in this chapter, reveal more about the people broadcasting them than they do about the real lives and practices of Jews and Chinese people. They tell us about the social, political, and economic worries that vexed Americans as they commiserated over a lost job with friends, or headed off to the mines for work, or spent their week's earnings at the grocery store. And they tell us about the complicated emotions that hovered under the surface in a free market economy of winners and losers. Emotions like envy, resentment, admiration, fear, and perhaps most of all, ambivalence. Ambivalence about the promises of equality and opportunity and meritocracy that were advertised as the American dream. These emotions bobbed up and fixed themselves to the waves of immigrants who came to the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Native-born Americans watched Jews and Chinese gain a fragile economic foothold in their adopted country and interpreted that success as a threat to their own property and job opportunities. And then I kind of go on to detail where both of those two stereotypes kind of originated from, which for Jews had a lot to do with being closed out of other out of fields like glass blowing and metal work in the Middle Ages, and being forced into jobs like being bankers and lenders because Christians were forbidden to do that. And so that was sort of the origins of the Shylock stereotype, and then I kind of trace Shylock as he comes to America and gets expressed in a variety of ways here. And then with the Chinese, the thrifty Chinese, a lot of it had to do with the gold rush and the waves of immigrants that came from China to America and had no families here to support and often could live on lower incomes than a lot of the white and native-born workers. And so there is an amazing amount of propaganda out there in the 1800s about how Chinese people eat rats and mice and live on rice. Americans couldn't get the whole that there was no giant slab of meat and potatoes and stuff like that. So there's a lot of talk about Chinese people eating rats and dogs and stuff like that, and basically living on lower incomes or living on less, sort of cheap Chinese labor idea. But these stereotypes are incredibly potent, and like I said, I think they stay with us today. Now, I have never quite been able to square the historical development of the stereotypes with the relatives of mine who embody them so perfectly, like my 90-year-old aunt who can't leave a restaurant without her bag being full of bread, or breadsticks or something like that. I'm going to try not to do that. I'm of course tempted to put a lot of your food into my bag, but I'm not going to. So the first 2/3 of the book or so is historical, and some of it is really chronological, and some of it is more thematic, like that chapter I just read from. And then the last third of the book looks more at the contemporary issues of cheapness, you could say. One of them really goes into the economics. Like I said, I was really interested in what it means that we have such a low savings rate in this country, and what the effects from that are. And I think we're now seeing the effects of that. So many people over-leveraged themselves in the last few years, partly because the money was free or it was cheap and easy, and partly because there are many reasons to explain our low savings rate. And in fact, in one interview, a TV interviewer said to me, "Aren't Americans just fat and lazy?" And I actually don't buy that idea. Yes, I think probably many people could benefit from a little more restraint and self-discipline, but there is a whole context for why Americans got into so much trouble, and part of that had to do with the fact that politicians deregulated the financial services industry in the 80s and 90s. That allowed banks to go through these massive mergers and take on more risk and develop these exotic new products like securitizing mortgages and stuff like that. Anyway, it all led to just a complete bubble of cheap credit being out there. Meanwhile, we had a political administration that refused to provide any meaningful oversight of this system, and two Fed chairmen who ignored any signs that we were in the midst of a historic bubble. And so that's partly how we end up in the situation that we find ourselves in today. It's not just Americans buying too many flat screen TVs and lattes. I think there's a greater context for it. And in many ways, ordinary people were just taking their cues from bankers and politicians who didn't want the party to end. So I do not think Americans are lazy, profligate pigs, even though some people have, this particular interviewer seemed to think that. I have another chapter on the synthesis between cheapness and the environment, and sort of using fewer resources, and why people like my dad were green before it became popular to be green, although he now sheepishly says that he had no idea that there was any other benefit besides saving money to all of his compulsive turning off of lights and stuff. Another chapter goes into the psychology of cheapness. People seem to really like that one because I think we all are trying to understand ourselves and the people around us. And that one, the origin of that chapter came when I asked my great aunt, my father's aunt, who's a psychologist. I said to her one day, "Why is Dad so cheap?" And she said, "Well, Freud would say it has something to do with unresolved potty training issues." And I said, "That's ridiculous." And she said, "Well, it's all about what you hold on to and what you let go of." And I was like, that makes sense, So that kind of became the basis for that chapter. And then I looked at not only what Freud and other psychologists said, but also behavioral economists who had some really interesting, one of my favorites was somebody told me that for cheap people, the future just feels closer. There's, whereas for people who are more spendy, they feel that the future is further away. And that made a lot of sense to me. And I think it explains part of the way I think. When you're cheap, a lot of it is an anxiety about what might happen next. And there's a lot of sort of planning for catastrophes. And so I think saving money has a lot to do with kind of creating some form of security in the form of a nest egg or something like that. But the chapter I'm going to read from is called Living Cheap in the Age of Mass Consumption. Like I said, when I talked about the topic with strangers, I'd have so many people saying, "Oh, you got to talk to so-and-so or interview me." And it became clear that lots of people were living cheaply. And so I wanted in this chapter to investigate some of the ways that people are living frugally in today's America in the age of mass consumption. And so I followed two groups and then one individual person. The two groups were, one was the compactors. I don't know how many people here are familiar with the compact. It was kind of a movement that started in San Francisco in 2005 with 8 friends who just decided for a year they weren't going to buy anything new. They would buy food, they would buy medicine, but they wouldn't buy clothes or cars or anything that was new. They could shop at thrift stores, and it led to like a lot of sharing of stuff, borrowing tools from each other, and it became kind of a big community building exercise. And some of them have continued on, 4 years later, living this way. But when they started out, a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle wrote a story about them, and they got hundreds of emails and calls from people who wanted to join their movement, and there was no movement. It was just 8 friends who decided to do this. And it showed them that there, like I said, there were so many people who either were already living this way or were craving an opportunity to find an alternative to a consumer society that seemed to be sort of going off the rails. So I did sort of an in-depth interview with one of their founders and wrote about that. And then I also spent a lot of time in New York with freegans. Are people here familiar with freegans? I don't know if you kind of use the same word out here. But they're basically a band of anti-capitalist, anarchist dumpster divers. And they're people who try to live outside of the money economy, they say. They dumpster dive for their food, they squat rather than pay rent or own homes. They walk or bike everywhere rather than pay for transportation. They generally don't have jobs, although some of them do. There are varying degrees of it, but I went out on a lot of trash tours, which is how they introduce new people to freegan ideology, basically dumpster diving through New York City. There are no dumpsters in New York, very few. So it basically means like sidewalk trash piles of supermarkets. And I had been thinking about waste and excess and cheapness for a long time, so I thought I was prepared for what I saw, but I was shocked by how much perfectly good stuff we cavalierly throw away in this culture. We would open supermarket garbage bags and find sealed bags of potato chips that hadn't reached their sell-by date or anything like that, along with, a lot of spoiled produce and stuff like that. You have to be pretty selective. This is why many of them are also vegan, so that you don't end up eating dairy or meat or something that could actually be dangerous for you. So, that was really shocking and appalling to me, and it changed the way I thought about what we throw out in this culture and how how much of a disposable society this is. And then, so there were the freegans. Those were kind of the two movements I looked at. But then I was really interested in people who are just living this way on their own. And so the last person that I wrote about, and this is the section I'm going to read, is one of those people. For every person who identifies with a political or communal form of anti-consumerism, there are dozens more who are solo operators. A common thread runs through the stories of these underspenders. They are people who, in the time versus money equation into which so much modern life can be distilled, choose time. Helena Sho dropped out of a well-remunerated career in San Francisco in the mid-1990s. Her work as a software analyst was making her sick. She was skinny and depressed, beset by headaches. She arranged to take a sabbatical and travel around Europe. When her 3 months were up, she stopped by her parents' house, sat them down and said, "I don't want to alarm you, but I'm never going to have a career again." Helena landed in New Orleans, a good place for marginal living. "I liked being here, where people talk about everything except shopping and what they do for a living," she said. "And I got the general knowledge that there was a large population of people living on the cheap." From them and from trial and error, she learned how to get by on less and less. She found a job taking tickets at a movie theater, and late at night wove through the city's streets with a garbage bag full of leftover popcorn balanced on her handlebars. That became dinner on some nights. Later on, she moved into an old school bus that sat in a friend's backyard in the lower 9th Ward. She slept there for a year, paying about $60 a month and sharing the bathroom, kitchen, and living room in the main house. She made her own food, listened to music at bars with no cover charge, and splurged on a beer when she wanted to. Now she lives in a row of 5 houses whose occupants have an informal cooperative living arrangement. It's called the Truck Farm. They share an enormous backyard where many of them raise food, and there's a communal washing machine and dryer to which they all contribute money. There is an art to this, a set of skills, Helena said of cheap living. We don't often think of it that way. We're more apt to view choices like the ones Helena's made as quirks or eccentricities. But she's right, it takes planning, thoughtfulness, and working knowledge to live cheaply. We learn a lot of those skills from the people around us. Helena picked up some of her values when she decamped for France after high school and lived with a single woman and her 3 children. The woman worked in a grocery store and brought home all of the shop's bruised vegetables, from which she concocted amazing meals. From her, Helena saw the possibilities for converting refuse into gold and gleaned the value of a freezer. Now she freezes the excess butter and milk she buys when they're on sale and makes stocks and pasta sauces in bulk when the ingredients are cheap. All of these activities take time. It's what economists call household production, the idea that we can spend time rather than money to meet our needs. Thrifty people are inclined to prefer the former when they can. And in exchange for her labor and her assiduous attention to resources, someone like Helena has more autonomy in her life than most people. She now works a couple of days a week at a store in the French Quarter, sometimes fills in at an art gallery, and does some gardening work for her landlord. But aside from those paying gigs, her time is her own. "I wanted to not be a prisoner of my own existence," she said. "I realized pretty early on that any day I was out in the street in the daytime and not in a job was a reason to be joyous." In the end, what do all of these disparate experiments add up to? They don't represent a unified challenge to our consumer-driven society. They won't topple capitalism or perhaps even make a dent in global warming. What they suggest, though, are new possibilities of collective sustenance and autonomy, in the words of Jeff Farrell, a sociologist who wrote a book about his own year-long experiment in trash picking and low-cost living. Freegans, compactors, and independent devotees of cheap survival are all thinking deeply about issues like community, sustainability, self-determination, and the contours of a meaningful life. They are creating alternatives to a culture that thrives on store-bought pleasures and disposable dreams. They're building worlds based on imagination and durability. So I'll just stop reading there and take questions if anybody has any. Thank you. Thanks.
So I have 2 questions. The first one's easier. What do you think of advertising and its effect on reducing frugality, because it's in the advertiser's interest to make you buy? And the second one, which is based on when you said that the psychology of cheapness is that stressed people are more likely to save. And I think it's the opposite. People who are stressed are more likely to buy to kind of relieve their stress. But people who are content have nothing to buy, and they're just happy to just laze about, read a book, whatever, spend less money. I don't know.
Right. Well, there are many forms of anxiety, and I think maybe cheap people have like one particular form. I'm not sure exactly how I would describe it or explain it, but I think a lot of it is just a sort of fear of the unknown or fear of the future drives frugal people, cheap people, and it is that sort of fear that there's a catastrophe around the corner and you have to be prepared for it. In fact, thrift is sort of indirectly related to hoarding. There are some famous examples of hoarders whose homes got so filled with crap, that they actually died from it. There's a famous brother, the Collier brothers in Harlem in New York City in the 1940s. There was two brothers living, by the time their house was excavated, the police found like 25 old pianos. They found the chassis of a car in the basement. It was just, anything that they found on the street they would bring home. And one of them finally was killed when a bunch of stuff toppled on him, and he had been taking care of his brother, who then died of neglect. And, and hoarding, psychologists have studied a lot on hoarding. Very few researchers have studied cheapness, thrift, frugality. It's not that interesting to consumer researchers, but it should be. A lot of people have studied why we buy. Very few people have studied why we don't buy. But there's a lot of studies on hoarding, and a lot of it is based on this idea that you save like every piece of string because you might need it someday. It's just in case. That kind of just in case anxiety, which I think is related to frugal people, cheap people. And then the other question on advertising, I think there's too much of it, but I also think like human beings we're not dopes and we're not dupes. I think just because you see an advertisement doesn't mean that we're sort of like programmed to immediately go out and buy that thing. So, I think I do think we should be trained to be better consumers of advertising and consumers of stuff. And we are susceptible. I mean, I'm susceptible too, although I would be hard-pressed to think about what. But, I like brand names. My sister and I are always calling each other and bragging about what we found at the Salvation Army, So, on the one hand, I do think that stuff works and is effective in a way that I don't like. On the other hand, I think human beings, we're not robots. We are able to resist those messages. I wish there was more education about resisting those messages, though. And I hope my book is a part of that, sort of being able to question the imperatives of living in a consumer society. Yes?
Hi, thanks very much for being here.
Sure.
In this audience, I'm prepared to admit that I am really a cheap person, but I think ordinarily I kind of keep it to myself. If I talk to myself about it, I would say I'm proud of being cheap. I'm proud of having the value of wanting to get value out of things. But on the other hand, I noticed that I don't talk to my friends much about it. So I'm sort of curious to know what you discovered about the people that you interviewed, how they perceive themselves. Are they proud of who they are, or are they proud of who they are, but they keep it to themselves? Mm-hmm. Any thoughts along those lines?
Right, yeah, I mean, all different reactions to that. In fact, I'll just briefly read the first paragraph of the book is about that. It says, cheap suit, cheap date, cheap shot. It's a dirty word rife with negative associations. We hear the word cheap and we think miser, whore, Walmart, made in China, something that's going to fall apart. It's an insult almost any way you look at it. An 84-year-old man heard about my interest in cheapness and got so excited that he offered himself up for an interview about his frugal ways. At the end of our conversation, he said sheepishly, "Please don't use my name. I don't want people to think I'm cheap." And I did get that a lot from people I interviewed who were uncomfortable with the word cheap. They prefer frugal or thrifty, which is fine. I probably, before I started writing this book, would have said a similar thing. But in the course of writing it, I started to embrace it, and I felt like the word itself captured some of that ambivalence and conflict we have about spending and saving. I think people often use the word cheap to project. Like my dad, a lot of the things he does, you could just call frugal or whatever. So what if he likes to buy gas at the cheapest gas station? But he's always been called cheap, and I think people use it as an insult, partly to project onto him their own discomfort with their spending or saving habits. His brother has no money to his name and could learn a thing or two from my father, and yet is always calling my dad a cheap bastard. And I think it has as much to do with comforting himself, to insult my father than about anything my dad does.
Yeah.
So, I kind of wanted to reclaim the word cheap a little bit.
I like that. Actually. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I have a really simple question. Is there a point where when you were doing the book that you went, this cheapness is really destructive rather than a virtue?
Yeah, well, many points. I mean, in my own life, I had a terrible habit for a long time of not eating lunch if I had forgotten to make myself lunch, and then at the end of the day, I'd have headaches. And it was because I was agonizing about the idea of spending $5 on a sandwich. That's not really doing me any good. Finally, a friend of mine said, "Do you think you don't deserve to eat?" And I got a little bit better about it there. So it can become very compulsive, not wanting to spend money. But there's one moment that I wrote about in the book, which, while I was writing, I've always been very frugal, but living on a writer's income, I had an advance, but it wasn't particularly large at all, and I went through it fairly quickly. And then I was living on my savings, and so I found all kinds of new ways to save money. I started making my own laundry detergent, and friends would want to go out to eat, and I'd say, "Why don't I make a picnic?" And it was just cheaper to make food and bring it for both of us. And but there was a moment where I was trying to save money by eating some of the old food I had in my pantry. And I had this can of clams that I'd had for 5 or 6 years or something. And I decided to make a clam sauce. So I opened them. I had it all, the garlic simmering on the stove. And I opened the clams, and they were kind of greenish blue, and they smelled funny. But they smelled like coppery. They didn't smell like foul, And I went back and forth, and I ended up making the clam sauce. And I was sitting there eating it while I had my laptop open, and I was looking up the symptoms of botulism. And I thought, this is ridiculous. And so I eventually did throw out the clam sauce, but only after eating it. This just went off again. Now it's on. Okay. So, that's not good. If you don't go to the doctor because you don't want to spend the money, that's not good. And, we all probably have the friend who never pays their fair share at dinner. That's not the kind of cheap I like. I like my dad's version of cheapness, which is really personal austerity and public generosity. He's very generous to anybody who needs it or needs his help. But with himself, he's monk-like.
Hi, my whole family is 3/4 of the way through your book. I read a couple chapters, and then when I'm not looking, my wife steals it and then reads it, and then when we're not looking, someone else steals it. So it's great so far.
Thank you.
I have a question around the connection between the delay in gratification and the lack of being cheap. So my sort of theory is that people, if they have $20 in their pocket and they're kind of hungry, then they're going to spend it because they can't delay the gratification.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Richard Bach, I think, talks about the latte factor, that this little thing you spend a couple bucks on lattes a couple times a day, that adds up to thousands of dollars by the end of the year. So I was just wondering if you saw that throughout any of your research about just people back in the olden days took a long time to knit a coat or to walk into town to even buy the coat, so they wouldn't do it. But now you can hop on Google and buy things instantaneously. So this lack of delay of gratification.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are so many opportunities for instant gratification everywhere, and I think there's a lot of research now being done on self-control as a childhood quality or just a quality that can help lead to success, and that stuff's really interesting because what do you do when we live in a society where everything is so accessible to us? Whether it's alcohol or spending, this just went off again. Alcohol or spending or pornography or whatever, it's all right there. And there's a famous experiment from the 1960s that a psychologist at Stanford did. It's called the marshmallow experiment. You know about it, yeah. It's in the book, where he gave a bunch of 2-year-olds, I think, a marshmallow and said that if they could hold off 20 minutes, they would get a second marshmallow. And some of the kids just ate their marshmallow immediately and couldn't hold off. And some of them actually did wait and received their second marshmallow. And it's really funny. They waited by singing themselves songs or trying to take a nap. It's very cute to me to think about these 2-year-olds trying to distract themselves from the marshmallow. And then they followed these kids, and it turned out that the kids who were able to exercise self-control did much better in life. They had higher SAT scores, they were much better adjusted and stuff. So, in many, it's interesting that many of the kinds of addictions, we as a society can generally agree to look down on them. Drug abuse, drug addiction, alcoholism, whatever. We can mostly agree that those are bad things. Shopping is one of the ones that we can't agree is a bad thing. Many people think that's there are a lot of interests who have something at stake in believing that having self-control when it comes to spending money is not necessarily good for us as a society. So it's one that I think that's one of those areas again where we have a lot of ambivalence and conflicted feelings and stuff. Yeah. So, but I got the message from my father that he judged a person's character by how well they could deny themselves what they wanted, which is partly why my sister and I, who are very similar, are close to my dad, and my brother, who is much more of a spendthrift. He and my father have a difficult relationship because my dad just doesn't have as much respect for somebody who gratifies themselves instantly. Hi.
Hi, great to have you here. So, do you have any estimates about, like, what percentage of the population, like, by any definition, would cheap people consist?
Mm-hmm.
And would it make sense actually for, like, big marketing firms to sort of
target them?
Target products for them? Or is this like just a fringe, like, group?
Right.
Which is not significant.
It's definitely not fringy. There's, as I said, very few studies on people who don't buy. But one of the few that there is called the Tightwad Spendthrift Scale, and it was developed by 3 behavioral economists at Carnegie Mellon. And they surveyed 13,000 people and found that about 24% were tightwads, cheap, and 15% were spendthrifts. Now, it's not a great sample because almost everybody came from responded to a survey that was on the New York Times website, and there are correlations between levels of education and frugality. The better educated you are, the more frugal you are likely to be. When they did the same experiment at a shopping mall, they kind of had the opposite numbers. So, it's hard to get a read on exactly how many cheap people are out there, self-described or otherwise. But there are, the Wall Street Journal, there have been stories occasionally on companies that have tried to target cheap people. And, there's a lot of them out there. Right now, Saks Fifth Avenue has, I don't know if you have Saks out on the West Coast, but they have this whole ad campaign going on right now about value, and how Saks offers value. A couple years ago, their ads were for $5,000 handbags. Now it's saying, you need that perfect little black suit, and it's a good deal if it's good quality and all that. And in Germany, where are you from? Okay. In Germany, I have a friend who's German who told me about an ad campaign for a retailer there and the ad campaign was called Geil ist geil, which means cheap is cool. So some retailers have tried to sort of co-opt this idea. I'm not a big fan of that approach. I'd rather cheap people stayed. I'm not uncorrupted. The boots that I'm wearing right now cost $350, but I would like to not see cheapness be co-opted and exploited as a marketing opportunity. So, any other questions?
I don't really know where the question is in here, but I might find it. But you were talking about delayed gratification, and this gentleman was as well. It seems like there's a real joy in delayed gratification when you get the gratification, which is much bigger than the joy that you might get by getting something instantly. And it really resonated with me when you talked about you and your sister bragging in the phone about the brand name stuff you got at the Goodwill. Do you find that that's sort of a common thread in people who do delay gratification, that the joy of finally getting it or getting it after having waited an appropriate amount of time is bigger than just going out and buying it?
Yeah, I find that for myself, for sure. I mean, a lot of the interviews I didn't get into the real sort of psychological sort of workings and stuff, and people often have a hard time articulating that stuff anyway. But my sister said she's like me, and she's a professor, and when she has something she needs to do that she's dreading, she'll usually say, I'll treat myself to a cookie when I'm done writing my syllabus or whatever, and it's just. A lot of people would just go out and get themselves a cookie if they want it. But to her, it's like that. She just thinks about what kind of cookie and what bakery and everything. And I feel that way too. I mean, I love great food, and I like to go out to a nice restaurant now and then and spend a lot of money. But, if I did that 3 nights a week, I don't think I'd enjoy it nearly as much as doing it twice a year. So I think that is a part of like savoring an experience when you become inured to it if you treat yourself in those ways too often. That's my take.
Kind of have a two-part question. One is, do you think the trend is going to shift now because the recessionary times? And two, what do you think about government spending? Like, do you apply these same sort of values to politicians, government,
right,
countries, what have you?
The government spending thing, which that question comes up because we now are more in debt than we've ever been. I think it's a very different thing. The government, I am a Keynesian at heart. I believe that the government should prime the pump when necessary. The government has many more levers to deal with debt than individuals do. The government can go into debt, but then it can use interest rates or tax policy or trade policy to mitigate the effects of that. When individuals go into debt, they have very few options besides paying it off somehow, by hook and by crook, or declaring bankruptcy. So I'd rather see the government spend. I think the answer to our current problems is not to tell ordinary people to go out and charge up their credit cards. I'd rather see the government take on debt than individuals. And then the other question, where is it going? Yeah, a lot of people are cutting back now. It's both anecdotal and aggregate. You hear about people canceling their cable subscriptions or gym memberships. It's not anything like it was during the Great Depression. We're not at that point yet. But, and it's also an aggregate evidence. The savings rate has gone up a lot in the last few months or so. I think it's temporary. If you look, there are a lot of economists who are out there saying this is a seismic shift in the American consumer. This is going to be permanent, a long-term thing. But if you look at the history, anytime there's been a crisis, human beings are very adaptable and resilient. We know how to cut back when we need to. And then usually as soon as the crisis passes, consumer spending goes right back up to where it was and actually goes higher. We reset our appetites a notch or two higher than it was. In 2001, after 9/11 and everything in a recession, there was a lot of talk about, the new earnestness and irony was out, and people were going to start spending less and be more family-centered. Well, a few years later, it was like Hummers on the road and all that stuff. So, yeah, I think we'll go back to the way it was before. The one thing that I think is different this time around is the environment. I think that is making people rethink the way we consume in a different way. So that could lead to more permanent changes on an individual basis. Yeah. All done?
There are no more questions. Let's give Lauren a big round of applause.